Welcome to Behind the Book, brought to you by the American Immigration Lawyers Association. In this edition of Behind the Book, we cover asylum issues with Regina Germain, author of AILA's Asylum Primer, a how-to book for both new and advanced immigration practitioners. With a lack of resources constantly plaguing the asylum field, and with asylum law in flux, the Asylum Primer provides a step-by-step presentation of the process of representing an asylum client in an easy-to-read format. Join us as we go behind the book with well-known asylum expert, Regina Germain. Regina Germain is a veteran asylum attorney and frequent speaker on asylum and refugee issues. She has taught at the University of Denver Sturm College of Law and at Georgetown University Law Center. Regina Germain previously worked for the Washington, D.C. office of the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees, where she served as senior legal counselor. What does your book do for the practitioner who has never done an asylum case, but finds him or herself involved in one?
Well, I think it's an excellent guide for a first-time practitioner in the asylum area. It's used by my students at the University of Denver, for example. They're doing their first cases ever, and it's a step-by-step guide in how to proceed with an asylum case, either affirmatively or defensively.
Is this a good book for someone who does asylum cases all the time?
I know from my own personal experience that I use it frequently. And I know other longtime practitioners who are never without the book when they're handling their asylum cases. One of the ways I use it is, well, first of all, it's very handy for me to have whenever I need to look up something quickly on a case that I might be deciding whether or not to take for my students to handle. It's something I take with me to every asylum interview and every immigration court hearing in an asylum case, because oftentimes there's an issue that you don't expect to come up, but comes up, and it's very handy to have as a reference in those settings as well.
As an expert on asylum law, can you explain the types of changes, both good and bad, that you've witnessed over the years?
Well, asylum law to me is always a moving target. It's always changing. From my own experience, what I've seen is that asylum law, in some respects, has become more generous over time. Especially when I'm teaching now and I'm reading the older cases from asylum law, when asylum law was really in its infancy. And I read those cases and I think that person would have been granted today. But the other thing, on the other side, what I see is that procedurally it's much more difficult now than ever before to win asylum. For example, when I first started out in this area, there wasn't a one-year deadline. And the one-year deadline is a bar that's very difficult to get over. It's very difficult to convince asylum officers that they should find an exception to the one-year deadline. It's very difficult to convince asylum officers sometimes that testimony alone a person can meet their burden of proof with testimony alone. So I see procedural barriers getting in the way, but the law itself at times, not in all areas, but in some areas becoming more generous. The areas where it's becoming more difficult substantively in asylum law is in the particular social group area, where the Board of Immigration Appeals, for example, has put additional burdens on asylum seekers to show that their social group is socially visible in the country, that it meets a particularity test and some other requirements that never existed before. So that's kind of a long answer for saying in some areas it's becoming more generous, but overall it's becoming more difficult procedurally. The burden of proof, for example, seems to be much, much higher now than it's ever been before. The language of the statute says well-founded fear. It's always said that. But now Congress has added additional corroboration requirements and additional requirements that make it more difficult for an asylum seeker to meet his burden of proof. So what I've seen in the early days, it would be that an asylum applicant might submit 50 pages or so of documentation in support of his or her claim. Now you'll see asylum seekers submitting 500 to 1,000 pages of documents in support of a claim. You'll see attorneys spend 100 to 300 hours preparing a case, whereas in the past, an attorney would not have spent that much time.
Your students use your book to prepare for asylum cases. Have they been successful?
Well, I have to say I've been fortunate at in my class. It's called an Asylum Practicum at the University of Denver, in that my students have not lost a case. Up until very recently, we just 2 weeks ago received a referral to immigration court, although we're asking for a re-interview in the case because of the conduct of the asylum officer. But my students have always used my book. I like to think that maybe has something to do with the fact that they've been so successful, but up until 2 weeks ago, they had not lost a case yet. Although they're ready, they anticipate the arguments that are likely to be raised. They anticipate, if it's a non-government actor, that they'll need to show that internal relocation is not an option. And the book helps them do that as well.
Why do you think there is so much change in this area of law?
I think that there's a perception that there's a lot of fraud in the immigration process. And I think that changes are often made to try to eliminate that fraud. I think that's why there's requirements for additional corroboration, for example. I think that the whole reason behind the one-year deadline was that there was a perception that there was fraud. But what I think Congress is beginning to see right now is that there were many people denied asylum because of the one-year deadline who were able to meet a much higher burden of proof for withholding of removal. And that shows that their claims were not fraudulent at all. And there's an effort underway to repeal that one-year deadline because of that. But that was the impetus for the deadline, was the perception that there was fraud.
Is there any particular country with the most number of asylum seekers?
Well, a country that's always at the top or near the top of the list of asylum seekers is Mexico. And I think the reasons why Mexico is still at the top or near the top is changing. It used to be, I believe, that Mexican nationals sought or applied for asylum for reasons other than actually seeking asylum. There's a lot of speculation about why Mexicans had filed at such a high rate. Some people believe it's because it's a way for those individuals to get into removal proceedings when they can't really present themselves to ICE to be placed in removal proceedings. But more and more now we're seeing Mexican nationals who are applying for asylum because of the situation in Mexico itself, the drug violence, the government corruption, and other reasons.
What are some of the comments you hear from people about your book and how useful it's been? One
of the reasons I love coming to the AILA conference is I do get feedback from people who actually use the book, and they're not my students who are trying to get a good grade. But what I hear is, and this is often the case, and the people will come up to me and say that they won their very first asylum case because they used the book, and the book helped them win their case. The other thing that I hear is from people who've been practicing for a long time is that they use the book because they don't necessarily trust their memories, and because they know that because I've been updating it every 2 years for the past, well, how many years? A long time, 15 years. Because they know that the changes to the law are going to be in there. So they don't necessarily trust their memory because they want to see, has there been a change in this area? Is there any new case law in this area? And they look to the book for that.
What keeps you interested in this area of immigration law?
It's the clients more than anything else. It's there's definitely a need for asylum law in the U.S. and throughout the world. People are always fleeing violence. Like, for example, we see it right now with people fleeing Syria into Turkey. Wherever there's a problem in the world, there's an outflow of refugees and there's a need for protection. And it's been very rewarding to help people in such dire need and to know that there is a law there to protect them and to use that law in order to do that.
What sets your book apart from the West publication on asylum?
My focus more is on the practicalities of representing your client. So there are parts of the book that deal with how to deal with egregious violations of the Fourth Amendment, how to do a motion to suppress, what do you do if there's a breach of confidentiality in your asylum case, what case law is out there on breaches of confidentiality. So there's a lot more practical, procedural issues that are addressed in my book than just sort of legal theories in the case. I think that the other book is more or less being like a legal treatise on asylum law, and this is more for the practitioner. And they can go hand in hand, and they can complement each other. That's the way I view it. I wanted this book not to be a substitute for that book, but to be there for the person who is actually practicing in the trenches, in the courtroom, at the asylum officer interviews. You know, it does also address substantive law. It doesn't mention every case that's ever been published on, for example, sexual orientation, but what it does do is it gives an overview of what the case law currently is. It has samples from a variety of circuits, and it's not repetitive by, citing to every single case from that circuit on that issue. It's a great starting point to know what the law is, and if you wanted to find more specific case law in that area, you could do a little more research to find it.
Do you plan to continue in this area of law?
Yes, I do. It's really been my life's work for the past 20 years, over 20 years. Ever since I took my very first pro bono asylum case, there's been no turning back.